Sai Deepak, author and lawyer, and he has argued the case in court, is joining us on the show. I'm also speaking with Mahira Sood, a lawyer at the Supreme Court. Welcome to both of you, and thank you so much for joining us this evening on Beyond the Headlines. I'm going to come across to Mahira Sood first. Ms. Sood, the question today and the fact that a split verdict has been returned, what does it mean for the rights of married women in the country? How much longer will the wait be?
Well, I think the split verdict was pretty much on expected lines for anybody who had been following the proceedings in the court. And the judges have seen it fit to grant a certificate to appeal directly to the Supreme Court instead of a larger bench of the High Court itself, which is probably good because the Supreme Court is already seized of another matter which I think involves similar issues, that is the notion of marriage. And that involves the challenge to the constitutionality of restitution of conjugal rights. I think these two cases are very closely interlinked, and the Supreme Court needs to take a decision on both of them. And to my mind, the Supreme Court is very clearly bound by the 5-judge bench decision of the Supreme Court itself in Joseph Shine, which clearly says, in that case, it decriminalized the provision relating to adultery. And it very clearly said that such outdated conceptions of marriage, where a woman is nothing more than the property of her husband, cannot stand the test of constitutionality. And it applied the test of constitutional morality to matrimonial relations. And I don't really think that the Supreme Court can escape what this judgment had to say. I also want to push back a little bit on the idea that this is a question for Parliament to decide and not the courts.
Right. No, we'll come to that.
Just one second. This is not an issue of lawmaking.
Yes.
This is an issue where the court is deciding on the constitutionality of a statute. All right. And that is very much within the court's power. That is, in fact, the court's duty. To not do that is not respecting the separation of powers. It is an abdication of its duty.
All right. We'll come to the arguments one by one, because the purpose of this show and this broadcast is to explain to people beyond that one headline that they see what the matter really is about. And my attempt, because both of you are the lawyers, is to make it understandable in the context of our lived experiences, right? There is law, and then there is what we experience on a day-to-day basis. And in that context, let me come to you, Mr. Deepak, on why should there be any kind of a question mark on whether a woman who's been raped should not get the same rights as others just because she's married? Can you just answer that basic question? Why does she not get the same rights just because she's married? So if she is raped, the law doesn't protect her equally. Can you explain that concept?
I completely agree with you. I have no quarrel whatsoever with this particular position. In fact, the argument that's been made before the court is very simple. That please go ahead and recognize, if you wish to, with respect to the very same issue, but there are only two problems with it. One, this is a matter of legislative policy, and I think that's where Ms. Sood also makes her point, and I completely disagree with her on this particular subject. I don't agree with her one bit on this particular issue at all, because it's not just a question of constitutionality of an existing provision, but it also translates to the direct consequence of enlarging the species of a certain offense, which means that this has to necessarily be pushed back into the legislator's territory, so to speak. So that would be respecting the doctrine of basic separation of powers. Now, on the second question, I completely agree with you. I am not for a moment saying that marital rape must not be recognized, or the concept of spousal sexual violence must not be recognized. In fact, evidence has been placed before the court to say these are the standards that have been followed across jurisdictions, whether it's a first world standard or a third world standard across the countries from Nepal to Australia to United States and UK. Material has been placed to say, please go ahead and recognize, but also recognize the fact that ultimately there is a certain degree of evidentiary standard that needs to be considered from that perspective, because whenever you choose to recognize a particular species of offense, then it translates to creating an ecosystem from definitions to evidentiary standards to safeguards. That is the limited position.
Can you simplify that? One minute. Can you simplify that? I know I'm speaking with two top lawyers here, but let's simplify that. When you're saying this, are you trying to say, Mr. Deepak, and I'm just putting this simply, that if you allow this, then women will misuse it? Is that your basic argument?
Not at all, because just as it would be irresponsible to make the argument that merely because a certain right is recognized, women are bound to misuse it, it would be equally stupid to assume that every husband is a rapist. So I'm not going to make that statement on either side. I'm making a very limited submission that from evidentiary standards to consent to everything else has been defined across the world when it comes to recognizing violence and sexual violence within the confines of a marriage. Therefore, all we have said is allow the legislator to define this. And secondly, please go ahead and recognize this with these safeguards. That's it. Beyond that, there is practically no delta, no gap, or no chasm or gulf between the positions of the parties. That's exactly the point I'm trying to make here.
All right.
Final submission, I'm so sorry. Just one thing. We have also said, precisely because the world over sexual harassment laws have been gender neutral and they're becoming gender neutral, please go ahead and also make it gender neutral. That's the only thing. Please take a look at the written submissions, and if there's a deviation between what I've submitted here and what I've said in court,
but sir, you're talking about rape within a marriage, and gender neutral rape is still not recognized legally. So for the purposes of this argument,
exactly why we said that please, no, the government is looking at overhauling the entire system with the submission made in the court. Therefore, we said, please therefore look at this issue as well. That's all.
Okay. Ms. Sood, would you like to respond to that? His point is to then let the legislature decide. Let the legislature decide, perhaps bring in another law which criminalizes this. Your response to that, ma'am?
Look, first of all, I think between Mr. Deepak and myself, our key dispute is on the separation of powers. It is on whether this matter is for the parliament to decide or the courts, all right? And that is a question of one's interpretation. Is the court being asked here to carve out a new offense? Is the court being asked to make a law? Or is the court being asked to rule on the constitutionality of an existing law, right? To my mind, the answer is very clear. It is being asked to rule on the constitutionality of an existing law. There is no question of lawmaking. There is no request. There is no appeal to the court for lawmaking by the petitioners in this case. On the issue of evidentiary standards, I don't think anybody has a quarrel with that. But I think we should also recognize that concern or that fear is certainly stemming from a fear of false accusations, which I just want to point out seems to crop up. And this is not about Mr. Deepak at all. This is about when, this particular issue and when this sort of bogey of false accusations that is constantly raised crops up whenever there is a law brought in to protect women. I mean, false accusations may be made in any other kind of case. Nobody says we should legalize murder. Nobody says we should legalize theft. Nobody seems to care about false accusations made under anti-terror laws, for example. All right, false accusations are a bogey that are constantly raised when it comes to women-friendly laws. And Justice Shakdhar himself said in his judgment that this implies a preconceived notion that women are inherently manipulative that cannot be countenanced by a court of law. And finally, on the last point that Mr. Deepak raised about gender-neutral rape laws, I think that is equally a fair issue that can be brought to the courts. But I do want to point out a slight contradiction here, because if the argument is that the court is overstepping its bounds in ruling on the constitutionality of marital rape, then I don't see how Mr. Deepak can be arguing that the court has the jurisdiction to carve out an offense when it comes to making gender-neutral rape laws.
Okay. Mr. Deepak wants to respond. I'll let you respond to this, and then I want to bring this back to the issues as our viewers understand them. But first, I'll let you respond, Mr. Deepak.
It is not my case that the court must recognize gender-neutral rape laws. I never made that submission. In fact, even in my written submission, I said that since the government is looking at overhauling rape laws in general, it is for the legislature to look at this issue as well. That was the submission that was being made. Second, please note that and I respect Ms. Sood as a lawyer and have opinions as well, although I have serious disagreements on several issues. The fact of the matter is, if you wish to cite Justice Shakdhar's judgment, there is also Justice Harishankar's judgment, because then, according to me, then we're only arguing on a status quo position, so that doesn't make sense. Please understand, this is not an issue where somebody is trying to say that if you give more power to women with respect to protection of her bodily dignity, that is bound to translate to some kind of misuse and constantly only with respect to abuse. That's not the submission. Please understand, that's not the submission being made. And Ms. Sood knows this as a lawyer who's been practicing before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court in several judgments has said that 498A and rape laws, anti-rape laws, have been misused often. Therefore, we need some kind of safeguards, especially after, let's say, presumption of evidence that's been reversed, so to speak. So all that is being said is that when the petitioners themselves cite other jurisdictions to show that there is a recognition of marital rape as a concept of spousal sexual violence, why is it that they cite the existence of the legislation, but they don't wish to cite the procedural safeguards and evidentiary safeguards? So why is it that there is let's say, a hypocrisy as far as that particular position is concerned, that you pick and choose whatever you want?
Can I please come in? Can I please?
May I respond to that for a second, Tamanna? Just 1 second.
Okay, I'll respond to that for a second, and then I must request both of you, because this is not the courtroom, right? People right
You've
now.
started a moot court here.
No,
it is
this is not the courtroom. What do we want our viewers to understand? Why is it taking so long and so many years to accept that rape can take place within a marriage? That just because you married someone doesn't mean they have a right on your body at any time, at any given time. And why don't you have the same protection of law? Isn't that the basic concern? My only concern is that we're getting into the minutiae of the law, and then we're moving away from what and how people understand it. In India, where it's considered wrong to even talk about being beaten up by your husband, are we going away from the reality of the country we live in? That's my simple question. Let me come to Ms. Sood, because she wanted to respond to you. And then I request both our experts to come back to, the context of where we exist. Yes.
Absolutely. Just on the issue of false accusations, I think even though the Supreme Court has made offhand remarks about a number of false accusations being made in anti-dowry cases, etc., the fact remains that these are very offhand remarks. The data does not really bear this out. In fact, the data on this is extremely flawed and inadequate, because all it relies on is number of acquittals or withdrawal of cases, which we know can happen for a wide variety of reasons. Very rarely do they involve cases of proven falsity. All right. So a case that fails is not necessarily a false case. We don't actually have the data on false cases. So when the Supreme Court makes such an offhand remark, it is based on its own perception rather than on actual data, which does not exist. However, having said that, it must be pointed out that even in this case, the petitioner, Justice Shakdhar, who supported the petitioners, themselves are not in favor of a reversal of the burden of proof. That means they're not in favor of saying that, just because a married woman has alleged rape against her husband, the convictions should stand, or that the burden of proof now moves to the husband, to the accused. Both the petitioners as well as Justice Shakdhar have said that there should not be a reversal of burden of proof. So that has never been the demand. And when it comes to Mr. Deepak saying that while there is Justice Shakdhar's judgment on the one hand, there is also Justice Hari Shankar's on the other hand, given that I think Justice Hari Shankar's arguments are not ones that you seem to agree with, I'm not sure that is necessarily a road we want to go down, because his argument is not just on the separation of powers issue. His argument is also very much on the fact that marital rape is not really rape.
Yeah, so I want to come to that point because I think in our discussion so far we've missed the glaring sort of counter argument, which a lot of our viewers perhaps have that question in mind. And I'm not saying this is your personal view, Mr. Deepak, but I want to understand where that is coming from. Is it coming from a cultural backdrop or an understanding that when you marry a woman, you own her? So how can having sex with your wife be rape, whether she wants to or not? That's the basic premise and question, isn't it? Why is it taking us so long to recognize, A, that marriage doesn't necessarily have to be a means to procreation? Having sex is not the duty of the wife. And no means no, whether you're married to the man or not. Why is that so difficult?
Fair enough. Ms. Tamanna, have you had an opportunity to read the judgment of Justice Hari Shankar?
Well, I've read parts of it, yes, but not completely.
Yeah. Okay, so the opening paragraphs clearly start with the position that he disagrees with the Hale's doctrine with respect to the wife being treated as the chattel or the property of the husband. Not just that, he clearly says that this is not a question of whether the wife is subservient to the husband or not. I'm sure Ms. Sood has a repartee to offer. Let me just finish my point, please. So Justice Hari Shankar has not taken what I would call a patriarchal position. Not just that, please see my written submissions which are in public domain. The one thing that I've clearly said is this. The question that you have raised rightly is, why is it that it has taken so long for the legislature to actually come out with a position on this? And why are we suffering from a policy paralysis on this particular subject? On this particular issue, I think there is a lot of meeting ground between the so-called petitioners and the non-petitioners here, because I don't see this as adversarial litigation. Most importantly, one of the specific prayers made, despite being interveners, was that the court must keep the petition pending and monitor the progress of the legislature's cogitations on this, so that the legislature is pushed to coming out with a time-bound decision on this one way or the other. This was a specific submission made, and it's captured in my written submissions. So the point that you have to understand is this.
But Mr. Deepak, in 2017, the government's position was this will destroy the fabric of society. It was then reversed. I'm not asking about what was written in the order. I'm asking about what a lot of Indians seem to believe.
Right.
How are you going to, fight with that? How are we going to change that?
Right.
That's why I started by saying, let's talk about our shared lived experience and the reality of the world.
I don't think I'm going to sit and answer a question with respect to an indeterminate or an inchoate group, because I'm not a mouthpiece for everyone. And I certainly would want to understand, is there an empirical basis as far as your position is concerned? Have you undertaken a poll on this particular subject before you attribute this kind of sweeping, let's say, notions to the entire society? Because there are equally people on this side who are specifically saying that you must recognize spousal sexual violence. Please take a look at the position of the so-called men in this particular case, and men have been on both sides, both of them saying recognize spousal sexual violence with adequate safeguards. That has been the limited position. Because if somebody is going to say that there is no possibility of abuse, there is no scope for abuse, then I'm sorry to say we are not just relying on offhand remarks of the Supreme Court. We are looking at judgments across the country where several high courts have said in 498.
No, I'm not saying there's no scope for abuse, but is that enough reason for this entire situation to be delayed, for that right to be conferred upon women? I'm going to let Ms. Sood respond to this.
Please, go ahead.
Look, there are different schools of thought on what the role of the law is. And fundamentally, that's what this comes down to. Is the law something that should reflect society? Does the law also have a role in reforming society?
Yes.
In showing the way? And I think it's a bit of both. The laws cannot be completely untethered, from what the social mores of the time are. But I think the split in this verdict, the reactions to it and everything else also it shows us that this is a situation where the law can step in to show the way, that there is some change in society that allows the law to do that, that gives the law some footing within society to do that. And in that situation, I believe it is not just part of the role of the law, it is the duty of the law to do that. And that, whether it comes from parliament or whether it comes from the court. Now that, as I said, it varies in different situations. But in this case, it is not a question of lawmaking. It is very much within the jurisdiction of the court to do that. And, look, the question is very simple. Is there consent in a marriage or not? For the court to say that, and here I'd like to just quote from Justice Hari Shankar's judgment. If the man in such a situation requests her on a particular occasion to have sex, he is exercising a right that vests in him by marriage and requests his wife to discharge an obligation which too devolves on her by marriage. If she refuses and the husband nonetheless has sex with her, howsoever one may disapprove the act, it cannot be equated with the act of ravishing by a stranger, and nor can the impact on the wife be equated with the impact of a woman who is raped by a stranger. Any such assumption that a woman who is raped in such a situation or is forced to have sex with her husband in such a situation feels the same degree of outrage as a woman raped by a stranger is not only unjustified, but is ex facto unrealistic. Disagreements in married life are but natural, etc., and may even lend strength to the marital bond. I think it is pretty clear from this that this particular judgment is not based on separation of powers alone. It is also based on a particular...
And that point was made. But, I will have to end this here.
Just one last line.
No, I have to end this here because I have another very noted lawyer who's also waiting. Today is a day of lawyers.
Is it a relationship of equals? Is it a partnership of equals? Or is it a relationship of slavery? That's the question.
Can the law determine that? Can the law determine that, or should we have to change that as society? I will have to end this here. We will look to the Supreme Court to give the same rights to married women as unmarried women have. Thank you for that.